Russia just offered to do something no one asked them to do. And that is exactly why it matters. Putin placed a proposal on the table that would make Moscow the custodian of Iran's most dangerous nuclear material. A move that simultaneously positions Russia as a global peacemaker, drives a wedge between Washington and Tel Aviv, and extracts maximum strategic value from a crisis Russia did not create. This is not diplomacy. This is architecture. To read this move correctly, you have to understand what Russia looked like 3 years ago versus what Russia looks like today. In early 2022, Western governments were predicting economic collapse within months. The ruble would crater. The oligarchs would revolt. The military would stall. The sanctions would do what sanctions always claim they will do: break the system from the inside. None of that happened. And the fact that none of that happened is the entire foundation on which Putin's Iran proposal rests. Russia did not survive the sanctions by accident. It survived through a systematic, painful, and remarkably effective process of economic reorientation. Trade that once flowed west began flowing east. Energy that once powered German factories began fueling Chinese industry. Financial transactions that once moved through London clearinghouses began moving through Dubai, Beijing, and Istanbul. The process was expensive and imperfect. It was also irreversible. By the time the West realized the sanctions were not producing regime collapse, Russia had already built the alternative architecture that made regime collapse structurally impossible. Iran watched all of this with the attention of a country that had been running the same playbook for 40 years. Tehran did not need to learn how to survive sanctions. Tehran invented the curriculum. Iranian oil has been moving through shadow networks since the 1990s. Iranian banks have been operating outside SWIFT since 2012. Iranian engineers have been building dual-use infrastructure, civilian in name, military in function, since before most current Western policymakers were in office. When Russia got hit with maximum pressure in 2022, Iran was not a student. Iran was the professor. The relationship that developed between Moscow and Tehran in the years following 2022 is unlike any alliance either country has previously maintained. It is not an ideological partnership. Russia is not an Islamic republic, and Iran is not a post-Soviet state. It is not a military alliance in the traditional sense. There is no mutual defense treaty, no joint command structure. What it is, precisely, is a sanctions resistance partnership. Two countries that have been excluded from the Western financial order, building the infrastructure of a parallel order. And that parallel order is now mature enough to produce a proposal like the uranium custodianship offer. A proposal that only makes sense if you understand the depth of the trust and the institutional capacity that now exists between these two governments. The Pakistan talks collapsed because the core demand, Iranian suspension of enrichment, was something Tehran would never accept and Washington would never remove from the table. That impasse was not a failure of negotiation skill. It was a structural impossibility dressed up as a diplomatic process. Both sides knew it. Both sides showed up anyway. Because the optics of not showing up were worse than the optics of failing. When the talks ended without agreement, Putin had been watching. And the proposal that emerged in the aftermath was not improvised. It had been prepared. The nuclear dimension of this proposal is where the real sophistication lives. Putin is not offering to destroy Iran's enriched uranium. He is not offering to return it to natural state. He is offering to store it, to become its custodian, its guardian, its guarantor. That distinction carries enormous strategic weight. Under this arrangement, Iran retains legal ownership of the material. Iran retains the right to demand its return. Iran retains the political narrative that it never surrendered its nuclear program. It simply relocated part of it temporarily to an allied state. The sovereignty argument, which is the entire foundation of Tehran's negotiating position, remains completely intact. For Russia, the custodianship role creates something that money and military power alone cannot purchase: indispensability. If Moscow holds Iran's enriched uranium, then any diplomatic resolution of the Iran nuclear question must run through Moscow. Any verification framework must include Moscow. Any future repatriation of that material must be negotiated with Moscow. Russia inserts itself as a permanent, structural participant in the most consequential arms control question of the current era. That is not a minor diplomatic achievement. That is a permanent seat at a table from which Russia had been explicitly excluded. The economic warfare angle is equally calculated. One of the central goals of the sanctions regime against Russia has been to isolate Moscow from the international community, to make Russia a country that serious powers do not deal with, do not rely on, and do not need. The uranium custodianship proposal directly attacks that narrative. It says, "You need us, not because we are threatening you, because we are the only party with the relationships, the trust, and the physical infrastructure to manage this problem." That reframing, from isolated pariah to indispensable mediator, is worth more to Putin's long-term strategic position than any battlefield gain in eastern Ukraine. Washington's response to the proposal has been characteristically ambivalent. The instinct is to reject any framework that legitimizes Russian involvement in Middle East security architecture. The competing instinct is to recognize that the alternative, a collapsing diplomatic process, and an Israeli military strike on Iranian facilities, creates a crisis that the United States is not currently positioned to manage. The Biden-era foreign policy infrastructure that might have navigated this tension with careful multilateral coordination no longer exists. What exists is an administration trying to simultaneously pressure Iran, manage Israel, contain Russia, and pivot to the Indo-Pacific without the bandwidth to do all four at once. Israel's calculation is the most urgent and the least publicly acknowledged. Tel Aviv has been running its own clock on Iran's nuclear program for years, independent of American timelines, independent of diplomatic processes, independent of what any negotiation produces on paper. The Israeli definition of an unacceptable outcome is not Iran having a nuclear weapon. It is Iran being in a position where Israel cannot stop Iran from having a nuclear weapon. Those two thresholds are very different, and Iran crossed the second one some time ago. The uranium custodianship proposal, from Israel's perspective, does not move the needle on the capability question at all. The knowledge stays. The centrifuges stay. The breakout timeline barely changes, and Israel's window for effective military action continues to close. The alliance dynamics that surround this proposal reveal fractures that Western governments have been careful not to discuss openly. Turkey, a NATO member, has been one of the primary conduits for sanctions evasion on behalf of both Russia and Iran. Turkish banks have processed transactions that Western banks refused. Turkish intermediaries have facilitated energy deals that Western companies walked away from. Ankara has maintained functional economic relationships with both sanctioned powers while simultaneously claiming alliance solidarity. That position is not unique to Turkey. It is the quiet reality of how the sanctions regime actually functions in practice, with significant holes carved out by countries that need the economic relationships more than they need the political alignment. The Gulf states present an even more complex picture. Saudi Arabia and the UAE have publicly aligned with Western positions on Russia's Ukraine war, voting for UN resolutions, making statements of principle. They have privately maintained and, in some cases, expanded economic relationships with Moscow. UAE real estate has absorbed Russian capital. Gulf energy producers have coordinated with OPEC Plus frameworks that include Russia. And both Riyadh and Abu Dhabi have maintained back-channel communications with Tehran that their American partners are aware of but cannot control. In this environment, Russia's uranium proposal is not entering a clean diplomatic space. It is entering a world where almost every relevant actor is playing multiple boards simultaneously. The most immediate consequence of Putin's proposal, regardless of whether it advances, is the demonstration effect. Every government watching this episode is updating its model of what Russia can do and what Russia is willing to attempt. A sanctioned, isolated pariah state does not propose custodianship arrangements for the world's most sensitive nuclear material. A serious geopolitical actor does. The proposal itself, independent of its outcome, rehabilitates Russia's image in exactly the capitals where that rehabilitation matters most: New Delhi, Beijing, Ankara, Riyadh, and the dozens of Global South governments that have refused to join the sanctions coalition. The nuclear proliferation consequences extend beyond Iran in ways that are genuinely alarming. If the international community accepts a framework where enriched uranium can be relocated to an allied state as a substitute for actual disarmament, that precedent will be studied in Pyongyang, in Islamabad, in every capital that is currently calculating the costs and benefits of nuclear capability development. The message the precedent sends is uncomfortable but clear. Enrich to the point of leverage, then negotiate the custody of the material rather than its elimination. The program survives. The relationship with the custodian deepens. The knowledge remains. And the pathway to a weapon, if circumstances change, stays open. The economic consequences of a successful deal would be significant and immediate. Sanctions relief for Iran, even partial, even conditional, would release Iranian oil back into global markets at scale. Iran has substantial production capacity that has been suppressed by sanctions for years. That oil entering legitimate markets affects Gulf state revenues, affects American shale economics, affects the energy calculations of every major importing economy in Asia. The geopolitical and the economic are inseparable here. An Iran that is partially rehabilitated through a Russian brokered arrangement is an Iran that has more resources, more international relationships, and more room to maneuver than the Iran that has been boxed in for the past 2 decades. The consequences for the sanctions regime itself may be the most durable of all. The Russia sanctions were the most aggressive deployment of economic warfare against a major power in history. They failed to produce their stated objectives. The Iran sanctions are the longest-running such regime against any country in the modern era. They failed to halt the nuclear program. What both experiences have demonstrated conclusively is that sanctions work as punishment but not as compellence. They impose costs, but they do not change the fundamental strategic calculus of a determined adversary. Putin's uranium proposal is the proof point that adversaries are now sophisticated enough to turn the sanctions environment into a strategic asset, using shared exclusion as the basis for alliances that would never have formed under normal conditions. That is the lesson that defines this moment. Not the uranium, not the specific proposal. The fact that 2 sanctioned powers working together can now credibly insert themselves into the resolution of the most dangerous security question on the planet. That capability did not exist 10 years ago. It exists now, and it will not disappear regardless of what happens to this particular deal. What Putin did with this proposal is show the world a new kind of power. Not military, not economic, but architectural. The power to reshape the rules of a game while everyone else is still playing by the old ones. This channel exists to decode exactly that kind of move, before the consequences become obvious to everyone else. If that is the analysis you are looking for, Subscribe to Profo. Jonathan Global Analyst right now. Hit the notification bell, because the next move on this board is already being prepared, and you will want to see it coming.